In this video, I'm going to show you two special ways of transforming images, the perspective warp and the puppet warp features. Puppet warp was introduced in Photoshop CS6 and perspective warp was introduced in Creative Cloud. So if you have earlier versions, you won't be able to find these options in the Edit menu near the Free Transform option. You will only see Content Aware Scale there, which was introduced in CS5. And that's something I'm going to also talk about in another video when I explain how to use content-aware features. But let's start with perspective warp. So I have this image here, and let's see what we can do with this feature. So edit, perspective warp. Once this comes up, you will be able to choose between layout and warp modes here in the options bar. You start in layout mode, with which you define an area within the image, a plane, a three-dimensional plane, which you want to adjust. So once I have this side of the street selected, I can then adjust these corner points to fit more onto that plane. So to get the perspective right in the image, I try to adjust these points slightly, something like that. And then let's draw another one here for the other side of the street. When I hover over my existing plane's edge, then I will see a blue line. That means I can join these two planes together, and you see automatically that plane almost finds the right shape, the necessary shape. So we set up this as well, once again trying to set the vanishing points up and also all these points to work perfectly. So that's my current perspective in the image. But the way we can use the perspective warp is that we can change the perspective in images. So once I'm ready with my layout, I can switch to warp. And once I click on that, I can start making adjustments. One of the options that we have here in the options bar is that we can automatically straighten vertical lines in our composition. So if I click on that, you see that automatically adjusts the image slightly. Wherever there was a bit of perspective distortion, now it's completely straight. But I can also shift click on a line within my layout, which will keep that straight. And then I can drag either the top or the bottom point around to move that point of the street, changing the perspective. So I can see more of the street on the right side or the other side by adjusting this point in the image. Of course, some other details will get distorted a bit too much, like these poles, but that's something I would remove from the image anyway by using retouching techniques, which we will learn about much more in other videos. But for now, I just wanted to show you how to use the perspective warp. And when you made your change, let's say we change the angle, then we can just click on accept by clicking on the commit option here or pressing enter on the keyboard. So once we change the angle, we can then deal with all the rest of the issues we created, like missing details around the corners. But let's see another example of the perspective warp. Once again, first I go to edit, perspective warp, and then I make one selection first, which then I align to this building here. So that's the front of the building or this castle. And then I create another one, which then later I attach to that first one. And I'm going to set up this as a stronger perspective here on the other side. Something like that. Maybe I can extend this slightly further up just so we can select all the wall on the right side. Something like that. I can even go beyond the image, by the way, with this layout. And we can extend it further out here as well, just to include all the details. And now if I switch to the warp option, we can start again adjusting these points, and you can see how quickly we can create a completely different perspective in the image. So instead of that low angle that I took this shot from, I can adjust to make it more like a higher point of view. And then it's all about just adjusting the rest of the image wherever we have these missing details. Let's see one last example for perspective warp. Once again, we have a nice panorama, but the center building, which is probably the most characteristic, looks slightly distorted because of this wide angle shot. So I am going to use once again the perspective warp, But before I warp the center building, I'm going to create a rectangle for this building here and another rectangle for this detail, because I don't want these to change. Then I am going to create a third one for the building in the middle, and I adjust it to roughly match how that building looks like. Something like that. And then I switch to warp. And now if I start changing this, you see that the image won't get distorted, and we can only adjust this part of the image, which is a brilliant technique, once again, to keep everything else in place. And we can even make this building slightly wider, just to have even more view of it. Once I press enter, we can see that was before, and this is after. So there's a few uses of the perspective warp. But now let's see the other option, the puppet warp. So this was introduced in CS6, and you can find it under the edit menu. I'm going to select it, and you will see that in this case, what I want to do is to change the posture of this mannequin. So with this tool, you might see originally the mesh if you have the show mesh option on in the options bar, but this is something you can turn off. For now, I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to define all those points that I wish to use. And in this case, these are more like the joints on the mannequin. I'm going to also add a point for the waist, another one for the chest, and maybe another one for the top of the head. It's good to know that this feature works best if you isolate parts of an image. In this case, I have the upper body on a separate layer. If you do this on one single layer, which is a flat layer having every detail, including even the white background, then this might not work as nicely as here. And to be able to do these isolations, you have to learn selections and masking, which I'm going to explain in much more detail in other videos in this course. But for now, let's try what we can do with these points here. So once we have the points on the image, we can start moving these points around. And what you would expect is that we can create different poses for this mannequin. So I can, for example, move this arm up a bit, something like that. And then when we select a point and hold down the Alt key, we can even rotate details around that point. So you can even create interesting dance poses like this one here. So I'm just going to create something like that. And then maybe also add a bit of movement on the head and also a bit of movement on the shoulders. Something like that. We can, of course, move the shoulders down or up. Once again, just to have a little bit of character on this mannequin. Something like that. And of course, if you feel like the arms look a bit crooked or bent, you can also add more points and adjust each of the limbs or the segments of the body. So when I press enter, you can see that's after, and this was before. So this is how the puppet warp works. But on another example, I would like to show you also that if you set up each element that you use with the puppet warp as a smart object, then you can also control these points at any time later as well. So you can see I have the necklace on a separate layer, left earring and right earring in this example all separated, and they are all turned to smart objects. Remember, that's something I showed you in the previous video. When you right click on a layer, you can choose convert to smart object. So we use that for scaling and preserving the rotation angle, but here it will preserve the editing that we do with the puppet warp. So let me start with the left earring. I go to edit, puppet warp, and then I can define these three most important points on that earring. And if I zoom a little bit closer, we can see exactly what's going to happen. So now I can start moving these points around and adjust the earring in any angle I wish. So once we are ready, we can click on accept, and you see the puppet warp is added as a smart filter, which I can always turn off to see the original or turn it back on. And by double clicking on puppet warp here, I will also get these points back. If I wish to remove one of these points, I can Alt click on it, that removes it, or of course I can define new ones as well. And don't forget that you can rotate points as well if you hold down the Alt key. Once you updated your Puppet Warp, just accept it and it will update here within the Smart Filter. So this is a way of non-destructively using Puppet Warp, which is another key term in Photoshop, and this is again something I'm going to explain in more detail. But for now, that's all I wanted to show you about these two special warp features. And in the next video, we will deal with another very important topic, selections.